people generally assume that people differ, right? They just recognize that people differ in those characteristics. But there's this hidden variation that we don't appreciate, which is that we differ just in how we perceive the world. Like literally, I think the nature versus nurture sort of dichotomy is a false one. We shouldn't think of it in those terms. What I would say is that we do have predispositions. If you look at, facial morphology of identical twins, it's really similar. If you look at brain structure, which we can do with brain scans, again, the brains are very similar, but you see lots of differences. So even by the time they're born, the brains of identical twins are not identical with each other.
How good is genetics as a predictor of somebody's behavior or their characteristics or any traits they have? Why do two people look at the same situation and see completely different things? Why do some minds thrive on structure while others gravitate towards creativity or risk? And how much of who we are is shaped before we're even aware of it? These questions sit at the intersection of genetics, brain development, and behavior, and they challenge some of our deepest assumptions about individuality and free will. Is our character encoded in our DNA, or is it shaped by the environment? If genes don't directly program behavior, what do they even do? And if our brain is shaped by development and biology, what does that mean for choice, responsibility, and agency? Hello, I'm Avnish, and this is The Early Perspective. Each episode, we explore how the brain works and what that means for how we learn, think, and live. For today's episode, we're going to be talking about genetics and brain wiring, and how that affects how we see, think, and behave. We're also going to be talking about why no two brains are ever truly the same. In this conversation, we'll talk about biological variation, brain development, genetic differences, and also what modern neuroscience tells us about neurodiversity. To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Mitchell. He is an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College Dublin. He studies the interplay between genes, brains, and minds. He's also the author of Innate, How the Wiring of Our Brains Shapes Who We Are, and Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. Both of these books were published by the Princeton University Press. He also writes the Wiring the Brain blog, which is on Blue Sky. Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Avanish. Thanks very much for having me.
Of course. I just wanted to start out by zooming out before we really get into the specifics of our conversation. Could you tell me a little bit more about your background and what originally drew you to studying genetics and brain development?
Sure, yeah. I studied genetics at Trinity College Dublin, where I'm teaching now, as an undergrad in the 1980s, and was really fascinated by the question of development, that is embryonic development. It just seemed like a really sort of central question in biology, which is how, when you think about the fertilized egg of some organism, like a cat or a dog or a human being, how it knows how to develop into that right kind of thing, of whatever thing it is, right? And just a super complicated kind of question, really central to what life is. And I was really just fascinated by it. I had a wonderful lecturer actually who lectured on that topic, and it made me want to study it further. And in particular, I got fascinated by the question of how does the nervous system develop? Because that is just an extraordinarily complicated, complex organ that has to be assembled. You've got all these different types of cells. They all have to be connected up to each other and wired up in just the right way. It just seemed like a wonderful scientific problem to try and sink my teeth into. And so when I was looking for a PhD position, I went to UC Berkeley and joined a lab there that was studying that question using fruit flies. So little Drosophila embryos to try and figure out how their nervous system gets wired up, because it was nice and simple. And then we could think about the principles that we discovered there, how they might apply to something much more complicated, like the human brain.
Yeah, I think really, if you look at the brain or just our development or the development of any species, is very intriguing because it's very hard to understand and just wrap our minds around how that even happened and how we got here. So I believe those questions are really truly important and amazing. Yeah. Thank you first for sharing that, of course. And I know that your work is, of course, revolving around many topics and fields. So if you look at neuroscience in particular, much of the research revolves around the foundation of how the brain is wired. So let's begin by really breaking that down. What does brain wiring mean at a biological level? Why is it important?
Yeah, so if you think about the way an embryo develops, right, you start with a single cell and it divides into two cells and four and eight and it keeps going, right? And as it develops, it starts to differentiate, which means certain parts of it start becoming like skin or heart or muscle or brain. Right? And then within the brain, you've got all these little cells are being generated, and they're just little round things like this. But at some stage, they have to turn, morphologically into nerve cells. So they have to grow out their processes. They have to connect to each other. And in our brains, there's hundreds of billions, maybe 100 billion brain cells, and they might make thousands of connections, but not in just any old random way. There's like thousands of different types of brain cells. They're laid out in very, very specific ways. You have these layers, really kind of complex architectures within the brain, and that all has to be specified somehow. It doesn't just happen. It has to happen in a particular way, right? That we develop a human brain architecture and not a chimp architecture or an aardvark architecture or whatever it is, right? So each species, somehow in the genome, there's some kind of instructions that help direct the way that the brain's wiring self-assembles. And that's the amazing thing, right? There's nobody outside of it in charge saying, you go here, you go there. It's not like there's some engineer directing it and designing it, right? It's designed by evolution, and it's designed to self-assemble. That's the amazing thing, is that all of that complexity emerges through the processes of development, guided by whatever these instructions are in the genome. And that's what some of my work was aimed at, is trying to figure out, well, what are those instructions? When you have a little nerve cell that's, say, in this part of my brain, and it's destined to send its nerve fiber across the brain to connect to the other side, say, well, how does it know where it is? How does it know to project this way instead of that way, right? How does it know to cross the hemisphere instead of stay on its own side? And it turns out that there are genes that encode signals in the brain that sort of orient these growing nerves, so they know, where's north from west, left from right, up from down, and so on. And then they follow those depending on which kind of nerve cell they are. They have a kind of an instruction to go north or go south, and so on. That's the basic principle. Is you've got some molecules that act as signals, you've got other molecules that act as receptors that interpret those signals, and then you just complexify that, right? You just say, instead of just having one or two, you've got hundreds, and they all work in these combinatorial fashion. That's the basic gist of it.
I think that really helps explain what brain wiring is. Brain wiring is just used in so much research that at one point it gets overwhelming to understand that. And really understanding the foundations helps you build off of it and then understand neuroscience much better and as a whole.
I think that's right. It's why taking a developmental perspective is really useful, because you can see, to understand the complexity of the human brain, if you look at how it develops, you get a different kind of a window on it, and it starts really simple and grows more complex in a way that's kind of understandable. In the same way, if you take an evolutionary perspective, we have incredibly complex brains, but if you look across other species, their brains are less complex, and looking at that trajectory just gives you a handle on how the different parts of the brain emerged, how they interact with each other, and how the whole system got more and more complex over evolutionary time and as it develops in an individual person.
I think for sure because each different perspective really paints a different picture, and that really just goes into the main idea that the brain is so complex and is diversified over time, and just understanding how it has come to be over millions of years or just developing from when you are an embryo is just really interesting overall. Since when you're talking about brain wiring, you talk about how there's a lot of complex processes. So Can two brains ever be wired the same?
No is the answer. So even genetically identical organisms, as they develop, what the genome is really trying to, what the genome encodes is kind of sets of rules or guidelines that help direct these processes of self-organization. But those processes are very noisy in an engineering sense, which means there's a lot of random stuff happening. So when I talked about these signals and receptors, those are little protein molecules, right? And they're inside cells or on the surface of cells, and they're jiggling around like crazy. And how much of them is being made is slightly random. When they interact with each other, that's kind of a random process that whether they're tightly bound or not. And so all of those things are, they're not super tightly specified in the way that they are in a designed piece of equipment like the hardware of our computers where you can control things really tightly. This is messy, wet, hot, sticky, goopy, jittery stuff that we're dealing with, right? It's just not really tightly engineered. So it's very kind of messy. And that means that the process, if you ran it exactly the same, if you ran the process the same twice, basically, if you started from development from the same egg and you ran it twice, you wouldn't get exactly the same outcome. And we can see that because that happens in human beings when you have identical twins, right? They start from the same egg. Eventually, that egg at some point, early on splits into two. The early embryo splits into two. And then you run the program twice, right, with the same exact genetic instructions, but you don't get the same exact outcome. It's very similar, of course. If you look at, facial morphology of identical twins, it's really similar. If you look at brain structure, which we can do with brain scans, they're again, the brains are very similar, but you see lots of differences. So even by the time they're born, the brains of identical twins are not identical with each other. So there's two sources of variation if you look across large sets of people. The first variation is that we start with different genomes, right? We talk about the human genome, but nobody has the human genome. Everyone has their own version, their own genome, right? So that's one source of differences. And then the other source is just this randomness in the way that development happens to play out. So it doesn't matter how many times you run that program, you'd never get exactly the same outcome.
Yeah. So since you talked about twins and especially how they do vary, I was reading about this case, I think, where two babies who were born in England, I believe, were almost they were identical twins, but they looked different. They had different skin colors, eye colors. So is this just what you were talking about, but on a larger scale, or how are such differences coming from identical twins?
Yeah, I don't know about that particular case. It would certainly be unusual if identical twins really had different eye colors and so on. Although, actually, I mean, even in individual people, you can end up with two different eye colors because there are some genetic changes that happen as an embryo is developing, right? There's a mutation that arises in some cell in the embryo that, in that case, affects a gene that makes the pigment that makes your eyes brown versus blue. And then you can end up where part of the embryo has a different genetic makeup to the other part, and you end up with one blue and one brown eye. I don't know if you know Max Scherzer, the pitcher for the Toronto Blue Jays. So he has strikingly one brown and one blue eye. So that's another source of variation, is that the genome in each of our cells in our body, those they can accumulate mutations as we develop, and so you can get that kind of a effect can happen. How much of an impact that has, it's sort of hard to say. It's very obvious when you see something like one blue eye and one brown eye, right? It's much less clear how big of a factor that kind of thing is, just generally speaking.
So, what do you think? What role does the environment play in people's how people are shaped, and how, how does how do genes and the environment interplay really?
Yeah, so here we can talk about people's psychology, right? So, and the question is kind of like, do we have any real psychological predispositions? Are we just born a certain way with certain tendencies? Or do all of those things emerge from our experiences and the way we're brought up and everything else? And so this has been this debate that's been going on for millennia, actually, this sort of nature versus nurture debate. And what I would say is that we do have predispositions. So the way that our brain is wired, that unique way that it's wired, does affect some aspects of our behavior. And I mean, it shouldn't be surprising that that's the case, because just having a human brain as opposed to a chimp brain affects loads of our behavior, right? So every species has its own kind of typical behavioral repertoire and behavioral tendencies and capacities and so on, that, just because it's a dog or a human being or a frog or a bat or whatever it is, right? So really all I'm saying is that within that species typical way of behaving, there's also some variation, right? So within humans, there's also some variation, which is due to genetic differences and the way that their brain develops and gets wired to begin with, right? Now, that doesn't mean that all of the differences in our behavior are due to that. Of course it doesn't. It just means we don't start the same, right? We start with some differences, and then the way that we behave in the world, right, the way that we learn to behave in the world is affected by those predispositions. So as I'm encountering things, and I was a baby encountering things in the world, maybe, I have a certain tendency to be more exploratory than someone else, or more curious, or more risk averse, or whatever it is, right? You can imagine some tunings of those kinds of parameters that would influence my behavior, and then over time influence the way I come to interact with the world, right? The way I learn to interact with the world. Because certain things are more interesting to me, because there are certain things that are more rewarding to me, and I just feel them differently inside because of the way my brain is wired. So I like to think of this, the answer to this question as involving this interplay between these predispositions that we have, these very basic kind of tunings, and then all of the experiences that we have. But the experiences that we have, first of all, are different based on the way that we're wired, because you and I might experience some event and feel it very differently from each other, right? Depending on what we care about and the way that we feel about it. And then also, the experiences are not just things that happen to us, right? They're things that we do. They reflect our sort of dispositions, right? And over time, we're more and more in charge of the experiences that we're having. We're seeking out certain kinds of experiences, and those are shaping us in this kind of iterative fashion. So yeah, I think the nature versus nurture sort of dichotomy is a false one. We shouldn't think of it in those terms. It's clear that we're not all the same as each other right from birth, but it's also clear that our experiences, of course, affect the way that we behave.
Right. So you're saying that people's genes can shape how they're initially different, but then over time that also shapes their experiences, and the experiences in turn shape how they grow and develop, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a sort of a yeah, there's just not a simple answer because it's not a simple process, right? It's this nuanced kind of interplay that goes on and on throughout our lives.
hmm Okay. Let's shift the conversation more towards genetics and the influence of genes, really. So genes have often been considered the be all end all when it comes to shaping somebody, but then as we clearly talked about, it's not the only factor. Especially when you're talking about how somebody is genetically predisposed to getting a certain disease or their
Hmm.
characteristics. Uh, People say that genes are the main factor, but your work has often challenged that idea that genes rigidly determine outcomes. So, from your perspective, what do genes actually do when it comes to shaping the brain?
Yeah, so when we're talking about genes, there's two ways of thinking about it. One is to just say within the human genome, there's genes that encode these proteins that act as signals and receptors that tell cells where to go and how to wire up, right? So that would be the kind of the baseline. That's just what's in the human genome. But then what's interesting is that we have variations in our genome. So I might have a genetic mutation that affects one of those proteins, and maybe it just doesn't work at all. or maybe my cells just make a little bit more or a little bit less of that protein, right? So each of us carries millions of these genetic variants that can affect this program of brain wiring. Right? So what that means is that different people are partly different in the way their brain is wired due to these genetic differences. So when we're talking about genes in that sense, what we mean is the genetic differences, right? So the differences that affect how the brain develops. And those can manifest in lots of ways. First of all, they can manifest just in the structure of the brain. So if you look at brain structures, then identical twins, I said before, they're not identical, but they're very similar to each other, right? Much more similar than fraternal twins or just siblings, who are more similar than any two strangers on the street, right? So you can see the effects of genetics on brain structure. People who are more closely related to each other, their brains look more like each other than, random people, right? Just the same way as our faces look more like the people we're related to. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that it's also true if you look at people's psychological traits, right? If you look at personality traits, if you look at things like measures of cognitive ability and so on, then people also resemble their relatives more than random people on the street, right? So the argument is that the way that the brain is wired is manifesting in the way that it functions, which then manifests as these psychological traits, the things that we recognize as something like extroversion or conscientiousness or intelligence or whatever it is, right? And then, of course, there's also occasions where it manifests as something that we call a disorder, right? Where it's not just within the sort of range of typical experience where we say, someone's more or less neurotic, for example, but you could say, actually, no, this person has an anxiety disorder, or they have depression, or they have schizophrenia or epilepsy or something like that, right? So sometimes you can have genetic differences that really have a big impact on the way that the brain is wired, that ultimately impair function in some way that leads to us calling that condition a disorder.
Mhm. Okay. That what you said really helps make it less abstract and a more of an idea that people can digest. You're talking about how genetic differences can lead to a lot of differences in the actual person. So how how much do genetic differences contribute to how people literally perceive the world? Like, for example, colors or their depth perception, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really fascinating. So, some of the things I was talking about, personality and so on, I think people generally assume that people differ, right? They just recognize that people differ in those characteristics. But there's this hidden variation that we don't appreciate, which is that we differ just in how we perceive the world. Like literally, I mean, there's some obvious ones like color vision, right? So color blindness, everyone's heard of color blindness and knows that some people don't perceive colors in the world, but there's much less common ones like face blindness. And what that means is a difficulty with perceiving the features of somebody's face and linking it in your mind to the memory of who that person is. So some people just really can't recognize people by their faces. And it turns out that might be something like 2% of the population is really unable to do that. It also seems to be a genetic kind of condition. There's a whole host of other kind of ways that people vary conditions like um, what's called aphantasia, which means a lack of visual imagery. So I have if I think of an apple in my mind, I can visualize that in my mind's eye pretty vividly. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
but many people can't, right? Like,
Hmm.
maybe 2, 3, 4% of the population just can't visualize anything. They just don't have a mind's eye, and they don't even know what you're talking about. If you say that there is no visual imagery there at all. Same with whether people have a voice in their head. Like I constantly have a song in my head on a loop all the time, but for some people that's like it's just quiet in there, which to me is bizarre, right? But it's such a deep difference, and you would never know unless you ask people, because that's just deeply what their subjective experience is like. I've studied a condition called synesthesia, which is really fascinating because there it's a condition where, for example, for some people, when they hear music, they'll see a color out in the world, right? So they're getting an auditory stimulus and they're having a visual experience as part of that. And there's a whole host of other kinds of that. There's people who taste words, thinking of like letters of the alphabet with colors, or days of the week and uh, in spatial arrangements around them. And it's really, really interesting, very sort of deeply felt, experienced way of perceiving things in the world and thinking about them. It's not just perceiving; it's also how they conceptualize those things, right? So super, super interesting. There's loads more variation there than people have appreciated, I think. And of course, if you're wondering where differences come from in terms of the way that people behave, well, clearly having those kinds of really deep differences in perception could feed into that in interesting ways that I think are really underexplored.
Yeah, I think it's especially fascinating that you talked about how people don't have a voice in their head or they can't perceive things. And even though that might be a small percent of the population, that's still a very vast number of people. Yeah, especially since we talked about how genetic differences can lead to all of these and then it's generally overlooked. How good is genetics as a predictor of somebody's behavior or their characteristics or any traits they have?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So genetics as a science can do various things. So first of all, we can just make observations that people who are more related to each other resemble each other more to a certain degree, right? And we could say across a whole population, if we see variation in some trait, like variation in height, we could ask how much of that variation is due to genetic differences between people. For height, it turns out to be like 80 to 90% of the differences that we see are due to genetic differences as opposed to anything in the environment, at least in current circumstances in Western countries where people get all the dietary nutrition that they need, right? That's not a source of variation anymore. So you can ask those questions without knowing anything about what the genes are, right? That you can just give a kind of a blanket overview statement about how genetic different traits are. That's how much of the variation is due to differences in genetics. But then you can go beyond that. You can actually say, okay, well, if there are differences that exist, then we can look for them. Let's look for them, right? So you can look across different people, you can sequence their DNA, and then you can look across the whole genome and say which of the variants that I see in the population are associated with people being taller versus shorter, or more extroverted versus less extroverted, or whatever it is, right? Whatever the trait might be. And that's how geneticists get at the actual genetic differences that really affect these traits. Now, once you do that, if you accumulate enough of that knowledge, then you can try and do the opposite, right? Rather than looking at differences in the traits and trying to find the genes, you can do exactly what you were suggesting. You can look at the genes and try to predict the traits, right? And there, it depends on how many of these variants you've found, how much of the overall genetic contribution to variants you've accounted for, and then how much genetics actually contributes to variation in the trait. Because if a trait is only only explains, sorry, so if a trait is only like 50% heritable or 60% heritable, meaning genetics only accounts for that much of the variance, then obviously that puts a cap on how good a genetic predictor could ever be, because there's clearly non-genetic stuff that's at play, right? That is just not included in that. So for most psychological traits, like the contribution from genetics to the overall amount of variation that we see is about 40 to 50%, something like that. For some conditions, it's a lot higher. For a condition like autism, it's maybe 80 to 90% due to genetic differences. Some other conditions are less heritable than that. So that puts a limit on how good we can predict. It's never going to be 100% because these traits are just not 100% genetic. And then there's a limit based on the amount that is genetic. How much do we actually know about it? So right now, for predicting personality traits and stuff like that, you could get people's genetic scores, um, and they're terrible at predicting an individual's traits with any accuracy. Right? What they're good at is explaining some of the variation across the whole population. You can see it's sort of a trend across the whole population. People with lower scores, um, say are lower on extroversion, people with higher scores are higher. But then within any of those bins, if you look at the very high end, there's still a huge spread of individuals. It's just that the average is higher than the average over here, right? And so right now, if you were to, people are doing this for embryo screening, right? There's these companies out there that are promising that they can predict all kinds of these traits about embryos based on these what are called polygenic scores. It just means a genetic score that uses lots of these variations, and they're awful. They're really just have almost zero predictive value when it comes to an individual. So the accuracy is just tiny. You can get a kind of a statistical trend. Um, yeah, so they're just not very useful for that kind of thing at this stage.
So, do you think in the future they could potentially be of use?
Yeah, so again, a great question. They could be up to a point, right? So assume we had perfect information about all of the genetics, right? We knew the effects of all of the individual variants, and not just singly, right? Not just by themselves or not just averaged, but we knew them in combination, right? Because this is where the genetics gets really complicated, because you could say, okay, I'm going to find all of the genetic variants that contribute slightly to intelligence, say, as measured by IQ tests. And there's a whole set of kind of concerns about what IQ tests measure and so on. But let's just say that's the phenotype, that's the trait that we're looking at. How well do people do on IQ tests? You can find genetic variants that correlate with that. And what happens is, for each of those variants, the effect that you see is a statistical average across all the people in the population that carry one version versus another at some site in the DNA. But the problem is it kind of glosses over the fact that the effect of one variant might be modulated by having another variant in a way that's not simple. And when you average across everybody in the population, you miss all of that information, right? So there's a problem if your model of how the genetics works is really simple. You're just adding up the individual effects, then you may not capture the real complexity of the genetic interactions that are actually crucial to predicting an individual phenotype. So you've got two limits. One is it'll just never be more predictive than the heritability of the trait, right? If it's only 60% heritable, that's as good a predictor as you're going to get from genetics. And then the second is if the models that you're using are too simplistic, they just add up the individual things as opposed to imagining or uh, identifying the fact that there can be these complex interactions, then you're also just not going to get a really good predictor for individuals. So we have a long way to go, I think, before we can even properly account for the genetic effects, and then we'll never get beyond that with genetic predictors because there's nothing more to predict.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, especially because what you were saying about how the test now and the knowledge that we're accumulating needs to be more complex, because looking at a single gene's effect is useless if you don't look at the hundreds of other genes that are adding on and compounding to its effect and how it's expressed. What do you think is the biggest myth or misconception in the entire field of genetics, or a couple of?
I guess one of them is this idea of genetic determinism, right? And we talked about it earlier. This notion that you just are your DNA, that your DNA is your destiny. There's a whole load of kind of phrases that are in common usage just in the general population that reflect that kind of thinking. And to me, um, well, first of all, there's a kernel of truth to it, right? In the fact that your genetics does affect how you behave and so on. But it's also just really, really simplistic in that it's not just your genetics, it's also things like how your brain developed and the experiences that you've had and this interplay that we've talked about before, right? And it also doesn't mean, just because we might come pre-wired in some way, there are some factory settings there. It doesn't mean that that's in controlling our behavior on a moment-to-moment basis for the rest of our lives, right? It doesn't mean we have no free will, as we're not just playing out this programming of our genes on a moment-to-moment basis. So, yeah, those are some of the ways, I guess, that you can kind of have this simplistic thinking about genetics, which really just goes way too far in ascribing power to the genes within us, where we're just powerless puppets. I think that just is not an accurate description of what's happening. And the reason is that evolution has crafted us with a machine that lets us think for ourselves, right? I mean, that's why we have nervous systems, is precisely because evolution couldn't tell us what to do in every circumstance that we ever would find ourselves in our lives, right? Instead, it came to this solution, really great problem solving solution, which is to say, I'm not going to do the work as evolution, you do it yourself. Here, have this brain, use it, right? And so that's exactly what we do. Evolution has made us capable of thinking about things for ourselves at a level that's just so far beyond anything that the genes are doing when we're deploying our cognitive abilities, that it doesn't really make sense anymore to say I'm just driven by my genes to do X or do Y. Right? Even though there's an influence, it's just not determinate.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I think that really fills an important gap that people had, because many people do use genes as really thinking that it determines everything, and then this happened because of your genetic disposition to it. Yeah, I think dispelling that myth is very important. So before we come to an end of this episode, I just want to zoom out and leave the listeners with some takeaways. How do you think understanding biology should change how we really look at or think about psychiatric traits or cognitive differences, like we talked about?
Mm-hmm. I guess the first thing to say is just to appreciate the diversity of human brains and human minds, right? I mean, when you look at it, we talked about things like differences in personality traits and so on, but also differences in perception, hidden kind of things where people really have a different subjective experience of things, right? And sometimes if we're interacting with other people and they're acting in a way that doesn't make sense to us, and you can get angry about it, say, why would you do that? It's because it doesn't fit with your way of perceiving the world, but it fits with theirs, right? And that can be just very, very subjectively different in a way that's hard to relate to. But once you appreciate that there could be a difference like that, it's easier to at least say, okay, I don't know what you're feeling right now. I don't know how this, how this is playing out in your mind. And that to me is a kind of a freeing realization in terms of interacting with other people, is just appreciate that not everyone is like you. Right? Not everyone's brain and mind works just like yours, and so that kind of appreciation of what has come to be called neurodiversity, but it's just sort of general psychological diversity. To me, that's just a useful thing to be reminded of every once in a while, because yeah, it just manifests in people's individual behavior and then in people's relationships, right? Is that it can cause tension in people's relationships if there's something sort of fundamental that they're having a disagreement about, where they don't even realize what the fundamental difference actually is. So that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of psychiatric disorders, and this becomes really relevant, for example, in discussions around things like autism and what causes autism, is to realize that actually something like autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that very, very broad range of severity in how it expresses itself, right? Um, where at the really extreme end, it's clearly what we would call a clinical disorder because it affects people's functioning. At a less severe end, it's really just what we used to call just a difference in the way people behave. But that's very, very strongly genetic in origin. Like I said, maybe 80 to 90% of the variation is down to genetics. And, my own feeling is that a lot of the rest of it is actually just how the brain develops. So, thoughts of this idea that there's like an epidemic of autism, that it's caused by all these environmental factors, that it's vaccines or the microbiome or chemtrails or fluoride or gluten,
Or Tylenol.
or Tylenol, right? All of that there's just no evidence for any of that. And so the real science of these conditions is the science of brain development and the genetics of brain development. And I think that's important. It's hard to get that message across because it's very complicated. It's much easier to tell a simple story like Tylenol causes autism, right? You don't have to know anything else. You don't really have to understand anything about genetics or brain development or anything, right? But the problem is it's just wrong. There's just no evidence for that. And I think so. So looking at the genetics of neural development, which is where I started my career, understanding the complexity of those processes is key to understanding how these kinds of conditions arise, and that includes loads of other conditions. I mentioned depression and schizophrenia and epilepsy, intellectual disability generally. So there's a whole range of those things where understanding the basic science of brain development is the foundation on which we can understand the origins of these clinical conditions.
Right. I think it's a really great way to explain the rise and the myths surrounding neurodiversity and understanding why it's so important to really get the biology behind it. Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us today. I think our discussion about genetics was really helpful in dispelling much of the misconception revolving the field and also just laying a strong foundation around genetics and neuroscience.
Great. Well, thanks so much.
For everybody listening, if you found that the episode today helped you find something new and also illuminate the truth behind the power of genetics and individuality, share this episode with somebody you think would learn something new too. And remember, neuroscience isn't something that is abstract. It can help explain your decisions, your character, and it's really intertwined with genetics. If you guys enjoyed this episode and learned something new, make sure to follow on your favorite podcasting platform or on YouTube. I'm Avnish, this is The Early Perspective, and I'll see you in the next episode.